do it in Malaysia. So so yeah, we did it. Yeah.
Okay, that's pretty cool. So everything done on Microsoft Teams and using our Google Suite.
Correct. Yeah.
Our government really could do with learning from Undi 18 and perhaps taking you guys on as a consultant. So YB Kelvin,
Yes.
in your opinion, do you think that Parliament can operate effectively if it goes virtual or hybrid?
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, Lavanya. Thank you so much for inviting me again to share some of my thoughts on something that is so close to my heart. And so amazing learning from my fellow distinguished panelists, especially the example done in the UK, and of course the ever-inspiring Undi 18 team that has shown an example and actually put to shame the real Parliament on how we should have adapted, we should have been creative in terms of adapting to the new situations, circumstances, and even prepare for the future. To answer that question, the short answer will be yes. I believe that we can function more effectively. And the reason why is because we are more adaptive. We're more organic in terms of dealing with the changing of times, especially in view of this pandemic. Actually, one of the things that I was pretty upset when they convened Parliament finally after the emergency, the last July. At first, we thought that they were going to table ordinance to amend standing orders to allow for hybrid Parliament. And just now, Sir David has mentioned about the example in the UK and how they gave the powers to the Speaker to do so. I actually was hoping that they would do it at that sitting itself. And I think it was important, not just for the current pandemic, but I think we need to prepare ourselves to be proactive to pandemics that are to come in the future or circumstances that to come in the future. I think while I, of course, much prefer physical, I love what Sir David mentioned, politics is a physical thing. Sometimes I do want to stand up and throw the chair, but in Malaysia, our chairs are really, really heavy. So it's not possible to do so in the in the hall. But then there is more, atmosphere in terms of physical interaction. So why I say we need to adapt and why I feel that the hybrid system allows us to function effectively. And I'm not just talking about the main plenary session, but something that I feel is very important, which is the select committees that are functioning. The reality was I was very upset that they did not allow, for example, my select committee to function during the emergency due to the emergency ordinance. I felt that my select committee for health, science and innovation played a pivotal role to keep the government in check, to give some form of parliamentary oversight towards the government's approach towards COVID, as well as the huge national immunization program. But then I raised it up to the speaker raised it up to our AGs, and then they came up with a legal interpretation, which I was very upset about, that they say that the emergency ordinance kind of overruled and does not allow us to meet and so on and so forth. So why is it a big hassle? Number one, I think Sir David mentioned about MPs traveling from different demographics towards Parliament, which is held in KL. It's not so much of the traveling, but it's due to the COVID-19 measures that is imposed upon us, especially like me, an MP from Sarawak. Every time I fly to KL, when I fly back into Sarawak, we are like a different country. We get quarantined for 14 days. And I can't just fly in, go back 14 days and then fly in again, and at 14 days, I need to serve my constituency. My wife will kill me and stuff like that. So there is some logistical things that we need to adapt in terms of why a hybrid system, especially in the select committees, is important. And number two is in the select committees, we have, based on the standing orders, we have the power to summon experts of the field, civil servants, ministers to testify before us in the proceedings. We know these people are busy and they have a tight schedule, especially during the pandemic. And now with the parliament procedures, every time they enter into parliament grounds, they need to take a PCR test, they need to take a COVID test in order to go into parliament. So it makes no logistical sense for them to keep doing it in order just to give a proceeding. So for example, in my select committee of health, science, innovation, it is important for us to get up-to-date data so we can live troubleshoot and give our inputs towards the government. So in order to get live data, we need at least, and I've stressed this more important, we need at least once in a fortnight meetings. Then we are in touch with the changing dynamics of the disease and the changing dynamics of the government's approach. And then we can keep that check and balance, or what I like to say, we can commend or recommend, in the sense that if we good practices by the government, we commend them, and this builds public's confidence. If there are bad practices or there are gaps of improvements, we recommend to help the whole process. But in order for that frequent meetings to happen, it has to go on hybrid. It's not logistical. It's not feasible for us to travel all the way to Kuala Lumpur just for certain briefings, and especially if it's on a frequent basis. So with all that in mind, I think we should have a hybrid parliament. I was so upset that we did not discuss it in terms of in the last parliament sitting. I feel it is they're not being proactive. They're not being proactive. They're not thinking of the future. As much as I'm going to stress this, as much as I prefer physical meeting, but I think we need to adapt and be creative to put in a foundation or system in place just in case we need a hybrid system. And it has to start now, not only when we really need it, but it has to start now. So I mean, I'm going to discuss, maybe later share all the technical obstacles that we face in the whole Malaysian system on how to implement this hybrid. But for now, back to you, Lavanya.
All right, thank you, YB Kelvin. So it's clear to see that there are not that many technical obstacles. It's mostly a political reason for why we do not want to convene our parliament. So we've got some questions coming in already from Facebook. Thank you. Keep them coming in. Please drop them in the comment section, and our social media moderator will continue to send me the questions. We will address them during our Q&A session. So going back to Sir David, one issue being brought up against going virtual or hybrid in our Malaysian parliament are issues of security and integrity when it comes to debates and votes. So how has the British Parliament dealt with this?
Thank you. I won't try and give a technical answer on terms of cyber security for two reasons. One, because that would rather defeat the purpose of having cyber security if I were to provide a guide as to how electronic votes are protected from being interfered with by third parties. And the second reason is because I know nothing about it. All I know is that it took some time to develop an electronic voting system in the face of a great deal of skepticism. And the deal that was done was that a system would be developed that would be demonstrated privately to the procedure committee. So the chair and the members who came from all sides of the House. And only once they had certified to the House that there was a system that was resilient and secure, would they be willing to recommend that it be used. And that delayed it by about a week to 10 days. So one was ready, but they raised certain concerns about it, including its usability for the average member in their home office, being warned that there was a vote coming, then being asked to vote within a given time frame, and being quite certain that they didn't hit the wrong button, as well as knowing, obviously, what the question was on which they wished to vote. And voting is the elephant in the room. You have to have a system that is resistant to doubt. People saying, maybe there was a mistake. I mean, after the election in America, one has to be aware there will be people who don't like the result and will say anything to undermine it. The House of Commons being slightly different from Malaysia, members don't have their own desks. So voting in the Commons has always been a little odd, but the passage of members into two lobbies and counting them on the way out. Now that too is not totally accurate. It's extremely secure, so nobody else gets in, but it takes about 15 minutes, which is quite a long time. So we already had a very old-fashioned, very slow and awkward and extremely unhealthy system. So there is less resistance than you might expect to a system involving remote voting. The electronic voting was obviously via a secure system, meaning one that was proof against interference by anybody outside. We did not have biometrics. So you might ask, how do you know that the person voting at the other end of the wire, as it were, how do you know it's the member? How do you know it's not their assistant or their spouse or their child or a friend who has been given access to the machine and the password and so on? And again, I'd rather not go into details, but we do. And it's not technically that difficult, and maybe Kira's Parliament was able to solve this solution as well. But the more worried you are, the more money you can, of course, spend on iris recognition or other biometrics. But the question is, how worried are you? We then returned, electronic voting was ended, and we then moved via voting on new machines, but we're still in person in the chambers to make it quicker, which we could have had any time in the last 40 years, to proxy voting. And so for the last 6 months, the House has had mass proxy voting, where the vast majority of votes are cast by the chief whip of the party concerned, who simply says, here are about 40 people voting, and I hold the proxies for another 260. And strangely enough, they're all voting the same way as I am. Now, that is not unknown before. The New Zealand Parliament already had that, and so did some other parliaments, but it was long regarded as pretty undesirable in Westminster. So I think the short answer is, it's not difficult to have a digital voting system, nor that difficult to create a secure one once you have a secure line with a password protected system and a little bit more than that. The other thing that worried members, and I do understand why, is they didn't know which way to vote. I mean, if we're being realistic, members don't spend the day sitting around waiting for the chance to vote 2 or 3 times a day on some complicated amendment to a budget resolution. You know, they're working. And the reason they know which way to vote when they're in the Parliament building is their whips tell them. And I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. They want to be told. They say, which way are we voting? Are we voting yes or are we voting no? And especially if there are then contingent questions. In other words, you have one amendment, and until that's passed, you don't know what the next question is going to be. Because if there's a government defeat, it could then be a different question that follows. So you also need a system which the whips are happy with, that they can indicate via their own networks, WhatsApp basically, or something like that, their own networks, we're about to have a vote on this, this is the question, and this is the way, in capital letters, we are voting yes. But that didn't stop people rebelling. And there was one electronic vote where there were about 30 Conservative members rebelled. And that, I think, was one of the reasons that the whips got nervous about electronic voting, because it's much easier to rebel if you're doing it from the comfort of your study in Sarawak, with your wife and family around you supporting you, than when you're doing it in the chamber and you actually have to, in front of all your colleagues, deal with the people you don't like on the other side, because for once you want to vote with them. So it does make rebellion a little more, you have to be a little more determined, is the view, that this is what you want to do, particularly if you're a bit younger and more ambitious. So I'm not being cynical, I'm saying that is a fact on electronic voting. But there is absolutely no practical problem if you want to do it. As you rightly said, on hybrid proceedings, it's a matter of will and not a question of technology.
Thank you, Sir David. So am I correct in understanding that the Westminster has moved completely to proxy voting, or do they still practice them both?
No, proxy voting has now ended because as of July, all the special measures are over. So we are back to voting in lobbies, unless, of course, we have a 4th wave of COVID come the autumn. But then we would return to digital. We will keep the little sort of things that look like thick cash machines, ATM type machines, that you vote by putting your security card there, but vaguely observed by someone to make sure that the same member hasn't got into the possession of quite a lot of their other people's security cards. So it won't be ever exactly the same again, but the proxy voting experiment is largely over, except, and this is, if I may take an important point, it was of course shown to be hugely convenient for those who were ill, or for those who are shielding relatives in COVID terms, or for those with serious home carrying responsibilities, particularly, but not exclusively, definitely not exclusively, female members with children. I say not exclusively because I certainly knew elderly male members who either had children or had even older relatives they look after. So voting remotely was really popular for many of these people, as well as for people who simply, it's easier than coming all the way to Westminster. But the proxy system, therefore, is now allowed for the people on maternity leave or other caring leave, including paternity, adoption, the range of special leave. But of course, the next political question will be, for whom else should it now be made available? Should it be available for those attending a funeral? And if so, how do you know, to be candid, how do you know they're attending a funeral? And should they have to declare, should they just sign it under their own oath, as it were? They cannot be here because, but you have a pairing system for that. In other words, you pair with someone from the other side and you both agree to be away that day, which is meant to cope with many of these personal demands on life. So there is a suspicion of extending proxy voting too far. That if every man who has man flu is going to take the day off and get a proxy vote, there's not going to be many members around.
All right, thank you. Okay, so moving to Kira, the push for our parliament is getting stronger from members of the public and political parties. Do you think our parliament should adopt virtual or hybrid sitting? And if so, does Parliament Digital or Undi 18 have anything planned to persuade our powers that be to transition our parliament?
I think Undi 18 at this point have really exhausted all our methods when it comes to advocacy. Interestingly, I mean, this year we have, we've done programs. This year we have done judicial reviews. We've gone to court. We've gone to the streets. So I don't know with this new government what will make them listen. But I think whether it's hybrid or digital, I think the most important thing is Parliament is to sit, right? And I think that's the fundamental reason why we're also having this discussion. Why is Parliament as an institution not being taken seriously? Why is it not considered essential services? And even if we're debating whether it should be hybrid or online, fact of the matter is most, if not all MPs are already vaccinated. We're allowing economies to open. We can go and dine in, I can go, we can go back to work. So why can't MPs go back to work? And I think that's what, opposition MPs have been consistently asking for as well. And also even UMNO MPs. So I think it'll be interesting now that with an UMNO Prime Minister, whether he will honor, the request of UMNO MPs of asking to reopen Parliament, no matter in what form, because at the end of the day, the pandemic is still ongoing, no matter how unstable our politics is. People are still dying, people are still getting sick, and we need Parliament to, to compel, access to information, access to data, and so that, I think the short time. I think 2-3 weeks ago when it was open before, again, it was cut short. We had so many good questions and good debates coming up because opposition MPs could finally have the floor to voice out their concerns, not just through press statements or Facebook Live, right? This is a proper hall where they're doing their jobs. And I think for young people who is who's watching and and we're wondering why can the government, regardless the previous one or the current one, is taking Parliament so lightly? We need to keep pressuring, Ismail Sabri and his future cabinet that Parliament as an institution should not be taken lightly. As we can see how, despite not going through a proper vote of no confidence, Muhyiddin was forced to step down. That was how powerful the pressure was, and I think, so we have, there's a lot of question that can be answered as long as Parliament is open. And of course, I think it's also important to establish independence of Parliament as well, which I think is one of the reasons why Parliament was not open for the past, has it been a year now, Kelvin? I'm not sure, but it's probably almost a year now that it has not been open. I don't even remember when the last proper sitting, I think last November, maybe, yeah. But that's how bad it is, right? And I think as someone who is, not working directly in party politics or directly in government, I think we need to educate ourselves. Many people are, when young people went out to protest, went out to discuss and debate these issues, we're always being told it's not the right channel, it's not the right channel. But when institutions like Parliament are closed, there are no other proper channels for the people to speak out, because we cannot speak through our elected MPs anymore. We cannot hold our MPs, regardless whether they're government or opposition. We cannot even hold them accountable. My MP is an opposition MP, and I can't even tell her that you're not doing your job, because she's not allowed to do her job, right? So I think young people need to educate ourselves on like our rights as a citizen, and they're not just rights to food, right to shelter, whatever, but it's also the right to have good governance. I think that's a very important area that we need to educate ourselves on. On Undi 18 side, we're not doing another Parliament Digital, but we have launched a similar program called Dewan Muda Malaysia. And Dewan Muda Malaysia similarly also has recruited 222 young Malaysians from across the country, representing each constituency, to represent their areas. And by this time, instead of a one-off program like PD, we're doing a 2-year, it's also a leadership development program. So they get to learn policy making, they get to learn parliamentary processes, we're working with trainers and to organize these workshops. So hopefully, I think if some of these participants end up becoming MPs, they're a bit more prepared to handle parliamentary processes, so we can actually change the culture of how Parliament is perceived, so that in the future, people don't take it lightly anymore. So, and it's not just members of Parliament making noises about it. The general public needs to also pressure parliamentary reform, and in so many other ways. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Kira. That was a very compelling message as getting the youth to educate themselves, ourselves, on how Parliament works and what exactly are our avenues for speaking up. And the independence of Parliament, that's a very important and a hot topic recently in our politics. We will be speaking a little bit about that later on. So let me move on to YB Kelvin now. What are the current technical obstacles to convening Parliament virtually in Malaysia?
Thank you so much again, Lavanya. Well, I just want to echo what Kira has been saying in terms of the importance of Parliament to open, especially during a pandemic or even during a crisis. One of the main solution for such a matter is actually a vibrant parliamentary democracy, where there is a uniting platform of ideas, debates, and approaches towards the COVID-19 or towards whatever crisis that we're facing. But the sad thing is, as you mentioned, Lavanya, the independence of the Parliament, it's an idea, but it's almost non-existent in Malaysia. Some people say the line is thin. I would say that the line is not even there. Parliament itself is more political than legislative in Malaysia, sadly to say. But back to the question in terms of the technicalities or the issues, that the hurdles and obstacles faced to implement a hybrid Parliament. I think number one, I think Sir David touched upon it, was also, of course, I'm not part of the House Committee, which mainly discuss on these procedural issues, nor am I privy to the previous law minister's study on how to implement hybrid Parliament. But this is based on my conversation with the speaker the last time I was in Parliament, because I was pushing for hybrid, and he shared with me the different struggles that they are facing or the different considerations they are taking. Number one is, of course, technologically challenged. The technology challenge, I think we know internet access in Malaysia is not equitable. I think in certain areas you may have very good, fast internet, but in certain areas you don't have internet. one of the excuses or justifications they say that sometimes maybe an MP does not have proper laptops and stuff like that. I think that's rubbish. I think as an MP, you should have a proper laptop. But there was one of the consideration that they say. So there is two sides of this technological challenge. Number one is, in my view, the asset side. That means the internet, computers, and so on and so forth. The other one is actually the human. So some people are just technologically challenged, if I can put it this way. I'm not saying in a condescending way, but it's still the reality that we have to face. So that's number one. Number two is, of course, the standing orders in our parliament. This is the big hurdle that I was trying to kind of circumnavigate and maneuver around. It's actually Standing Order 83(5)(a), which says that parliament sitting or even select committees has to be done, and I quote, within the premise of the parliament. So with that strong word, within the premise of parliament, basically it implies a physical meeting, that there cannot be any other parliament sessions outside of the premise of parliament. I tried to challenge this. I actually brought it up to the speaker, and the speaker pushed it up to the AG at that time to get a legal advice. I said, can this interpretation of premise of parliament be expanded? In a sense, for example, a Zoom like we're having right now, since Bersih is the main moderator or the host of this Zoom, can this room be interpreted as a premise of Bersih per se? So if Parliament hosts a Zoom meeting, and this is a Zoom, official Zoom room, can this Zoom room be interpreted as premise of Parliament in the sense that it is an official room under the responsibility, under the moderation of the Parliament? However, that interpretation was rejected by the AG, and they felt that they were basically, don't mind me saying, a bit timid to extend the interpretation towards that, and that kind of really limits us. I actually wrote a letter to the speaker last parliament session. I pressured him on it to actually use his powers under Standing Orders 199, which says that if there is nothing, okay, I'm paraphrasing, if there is to use his powers on issues that are not stated in the standing orders, if that means if it's not specifically stated in any other standing orders, the speaker can make a decision to do something about it, or to make a call about it. So I was pushing the speaker to use that standing orders to make a ruling to allow, as I said, to interpret a Zoom room or whatever, Microsoft or whatever, a hybrid room as a premise of Parliament. He told me that he will get back to me within a week, but then we know what happened in the last Parliament session, and everything got distracted from it. Everything was put in the back burner. So that's number two. Standing orders limitations. Oh, besides that maneuver that I tried with the speaker in terms of extending the interpretation, we also submitted a letter to ask him to table a motion for, hopefully, to compel the government to table a motion so that the speaker can suspend certain standing orders, and I'm specifically to suspend that standing order. However, the speaker was quite reluctant. He says that will need to come from the government, and he wasn't sure whether the government was motivated to do so. I asked him to talk to, at that time, YB Taqiyuddin, but we know what happened after that. So that's number two. Number three, I think that the other consideration was legal immunity. And this is the parliamentary privilege, that we can discuss things in Parliament freely. Article 63(2) of the Federal Constitution basically gives lawmakers that we are not liable for our actions or speech in Parliament itself. Of course, there are exceptions, but then the question is, if it's hybrid, does this interpretation of the Federal Constitution extends to a hybrid system? That's number three. Number four is, I think Sir David touched it very comprehensively, which just now was on the issue of voting. When it comes to voting of a bill, of an amendment and stuff like that, how safe is electronic voting? How viable is it? Is it representative of what we want to vote? Issues of cybersecurity, and so on and so forth. Number five, of course, is the spontaneity of debates. I think this is the main rejection by most member of parliaments, is the concern that if things are in a hybrid system, the spontaneity of debates will be very severely limited. Even the limit to freedom to question, to ask for clarifications We do not just want to attend a lecture or stuff like that, but we need to have the freedom to voice out whether disagreements from the ground, whether input, recommendations, so on and so forth. So these are the 5 main issues that were faced, or at least at that time the government of the day were looking at as an excuse why they find it difficult to implement the hybrid system. But I fully agree with what Sir David mentioned just now. It's actually basically a matter of will rather than technological or even legal technicalities. It's whether finding the political will to do so. But the reality is, as I said again, Parliament in Malaysia, sadly, is more political than legislative. So with that, back to you, Lavanya.
Thank you, IB. So basically, besides the lack of political will, which is perhaps the most obvious reason why our parliament is not moving to a platform, nor is it or has it properly convened yet in person, it would be our technical obstacles firstly, Wi-Fi and access to voting, and as well as certain members who might be a bit more technologically challenged. Secondly, looking at parliamentary sitting being done within the premise. Can we challenge the standing order or not? And then article in the Constitution on freedom of speech. Can the MPs have freedom of speech when they are debating on a virtual platform? And issues of voting, cybersecurity and whatnot, as well as spontaneity with regards to the debates. So we have some questions already coming through Facebook. Keep them coming. We will address them very shortly. I would like to go back to Sir David and ask him based on your opinion, from what you've experienced in the UK, what do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of adapting to a virtual parliamentary sitting in Malaysia?
I tried to be brief. I mean, the advantages seem to me so self-evident that Parliament must meet. It is as simple as that. And it may not be fun meeting in this way. It may be less of a spectacle for the public. Although again, to be candid, having attended 2 sittings in Kuala Lumpur, I neither thought it was a particularly exciting spectacle, nor did I notice a lot of spontaneity. And the same can apply sometimes at Westminster, that people who resist the virtual sittings and hybrid sittings seem to have a rather romantic view of what current sittings are like, which are in fact a succession usually of prepared speeches with occasional, sometimes abusive interruptions, albeit good-humoured, I think, of a parliamentary style that is very Commonwealth. It's the same, it's the Westminster system. And obviously it's not the same, but we mustn't pretend that we mustn't pretend that members are sitting there and because they're there and discussing in the tea room, that they change their mind. I mean, they vote with parties, that's how they got there, and it's a political process. So let's not over-romanticize what it is that we are losing when we move to a hybrid parliament. So the advantages are that business carries on, the nation's business, the inquest of the nation, questions can be put. It is an advantage to government as well. And before Parliament resumed, in our 4 weeks long recess over Easter 2020, the government very much wanted to put out all sorts of messages about the emergency, and they were reduced to using a new press conference way, but without members of the press being physically present. So Mr. Johnson and the 2 medical officers would be in a virtually large empty room, 2 meters removed from one another, answering questions from a journalist on a television screen. Well, that isn't great. And actually, they had a much better message to put over when they're seen in the House of Commons making a statement and saying, this is what is happening. This is what we'll be doing about distancing and all the COVID business. The second example, an advantage, which we haven't mentioned, although Kira sort of referred to it, I think, is that oddly enough, it made Parliament seem much more approachable to millions of people. Because instead of seeing members on green benches, or in the case of Malaysia, on these rather grand wooden beautifully carved wooden sort of thrones in which Kelvin and his colleagues sit. They were seeing them in their natural habitat of their home office. And there was a certain amount of hilarity at first because some of them were perhaps not meaning to, involuntarily revealing things about their reading habits or their home lives that they didn't mean to, because people would look at the background rather more closely than the foreground. But joking aside, it really brought to lots of people, according to survey evidence, a realization that members were human and that they were just ordinary people who were doing this job, and that they didn't always dress very well, and they looked tired, and they had children in the house and pets, and electronic problems and so on. So it was no bad thing to say, you know, they all come to Westminster and then you take up a particular habit of dress and manner, but it made it much more open. So that was a big advantage. Plus, as I say, those who anyway found coming to Westminster difficult for very good reason were the more able to take part as a result. They didn't have to juggle domestic responsibilities so much with trying to get down to make a speech somewhere. I think we've spoken about the loss of spontaneity and so on. Could I just say a word about select committees, which I think is terribly important. I mean, it is ridiculous that witnesses are expected to put themselves out and put themselves in harm's way, potentially, in coming to a parliament to give evidence. There is no disadvantage at all in having them on screen. Obviously, people will say, oh, I like to see the white of their eyes, as the phrase is. You want to get an idea of their physicality because are they lying or not? And a defense lawyer will certainly like that when cross-questioning a prosecution witness, that they'd rather see them in the box. But it's not necessary. You cannot say it's necessary. It isn't in a court giving evidence. You can give it by video link if you're a child or a domestic abuse victim. So there's no reason why Kelvin's witnesses to his committee, who are obviously frantically busy trying to deal with a pandemic, should drag themselves into the middle of Kuala Lumpur for half an hour in front of that. That's absurd. But I think it's absurd for members too. The members, it's very easy to run a select committee hearing. I mean, it's only 6 or 7 members on Zoom. It's like us, with a chair who can be, obviously the chair and the technical people want to be together so that he or she can say, I'm bringing in this member to ask the next question. But it's not difficult like with 650. It doesn't have to be all playbooked out in advance. So there is no reason to do that at all. And finally, the one thing which I want to say, which was a very strong view at Westminster throughout, and which I think everyone will agree, is that it's important that Parliament neither is seen to be less willing to do its business than others, which I think Kira mentioned. You know, everyone else is going back to work, or why shouldn't they? But also not more willing. So that Parliament has been very careful to follow public health guidance all the way. And I think it's quite important. And I don't know anything about what's happening in Malaysia as regards meetings or the particular COVID outbreak in Parliament. But if Public Health England, who are our authority, said anything, then we follow it. Because it's important Parliament follows the rules like everybody else and doesn't think it's either too special and we're not meeting or we are meeting. If they do meet, it should be because the rules permit them to meet, not just because they want to.
Okay, thank you, Sir David. Since you already touched on the question of select committee, we do have a question from one of our audience asking about how the select committees met in a hybrid sitting and what were the practical considerations that had to be taken into account.
Well, forgive my pressing on. As I said, there obviously were practical considerations, but my understanding, and I'm happily retired, but my understanding from colleagues is that it wasn't that difficult. The technical, as I say, the technical obstacles to having 3 or 4 people giving evidence, any one of whom can speak, but that is of course true when they're in the room. You just want to make sure they don't interrupt one another, which on Zoom, as we know, can be difficult, and that they have their microphones off if they're not speaking. Queuing in, which is obviously the television term, queuing in a group of 6 or 7 members max to ask their questions is also not difficult. And the whole thing was broadcastable, which I should also have said is really important, that whatever happens, and especially in the plenary, that whatever the public can see should, so far as possible, be like what they see when they're watching a parliamentary session anyway. That doesn't mean they have to see all the silent majority, but that they must hear they must see who is speaking, and perhaps an occasional reaction shot from those who are not speaking, particularly if they're being referred to. But on a select committee, it really, in the end of the day, was relatively technically easy. The problem arose from private meetings, and I don't know if Kelvin's committee meets in private, but committees do meet in private for some evidence, for security reasons, but also to discuss among themselves what their conclusions are. And the only concern raised there was, how do you know that you are in private? I mean, how do you know now? You're seeing me. For all you know, out of sight in my study are a number of my friends and relations. Curiously enough, they're not, although they would love to be taking part, but they're not here today. But they could be. And if it was a private meeting of a committee, more likely it would be their research assistant or a political colleague of some sort, which sort of breaks the feeling of trust that you need among members from different parties having a very political discussion. So if Kelvin's committee is discussing, are they going to be critical about a particular measure? And if so, how critical? I imagine is really difficult to get everyone on a consensus, and you must know you're private. There is no technical solution to that I know of. You simply have to say to members, it must be private. You can't enforce it, can you? But that, from my memory, was the only significant issue that arose. In terms of connection, of course, some members' connections are stronger than others. I mean, electronic connections. You know, we have black spots and yellow spots and all sorts of spots where Wi-Fi doesn't happen. But that is soluble, particularly with time. Because oddly enough, if someone is a member of parliament trying to take part and they say, this isn't just for my office work, it's so I can be a member of parliament, the telephone company often gets an extra sort of boost in the work it's prepared to put in to make sure that Wi-Fi does reach these possibly relatively remote places.
Okay, thank you, Sir David. So basically, quite easy then for parliamentary select committees to meet, unless it's a private setting, in which case then there comes an issue of trust and sticking to the rules when private has to stay private. So let me direct one last question towards YB Kelvin, and then I will start taking questions from our Facebook. YB Kelvin, in terms of equitable representation, how would a virtual or hybrid parliamentary sitting impact parliamentarians from East Malaysia? Or would this be largely positive or negative?
Again, thank you so much for the question. I think in terms of the plenary main parliament session, I think not so much difference to be made, because in general, most East Malaysian, if not all, will fly over for the main plenary session. I think the one that will really have an impact if it's hybrid on a positive note will be the select committees, as I mentioned just now. I think I just want to reiterate what I said before. A lot of East Malaysians, we have a lot of quarantine or COVID-19 restrictions every time we fly back. And so to fly in and fly out does not make sense. On top of that, there are very limited flights now due to, again, the COVID-19 restrictions from Sabah, Sarawak to Kuala Lumpur and back. So sometimes we have to fly in much earlier and fly back much later. So that does not make logistical sense for us in terms of also servicing our constituency and our responsibility back home. So, but I just want to pick up a little what Sir David mentioned just now, and I fully agree in terms of a parliamentary select committee. I don't see how a hybrid system will have any, should be an obstacle. He mentioned just now that maybe some people want, especially in the proceedings, they want to kind of question, interrogate somebody. They want to see his body language, they want to see his eyes, they want to see his demeanor and so on and so forth. But I think at least on my select committee of health, science and innovation and the approach that we want to go, we are not at a court. I mean, the spirit is not at a court or interrogation where we are fight for fault finding, we're trying to nail somebody. But as I said, the spirit that we are trying to at least represent or reflect is to commend and to recommend. So in that sense, I think a hybrid system is more than sufficient. There shouldn't be any excuses in terms of doing that. And from there can be constructive discussions in terms of that. So again, it is not fault finding, but really having live troubleshooting together with the government. Because we have always said this, in order to get through this pandemic, we need a whole society, whole of government approach. And what better platform to have that or activate that is in the select committee itself. So that is, I think, there shouldn't be any limitations, and it's a positive effect if we can have a hybrid system. So yeah, back to you.
Okay, so it would largely benefit a lot of our MPs from Sabah Sarawak if we could go hybrid or virtual. All right, so now we're moving to questions from Facebook. Please keep your questions coming in. We'll be answering them now. So we have a question to YB Kelvin. Should the role of the speaker in Malaysia be re-examined, especially its reliance towards the executive or the government? And if so, are there any recommendations put forth within both sides of the bench, and how realistic will reforms be carried out?
Again, of course, ideally, as I said, there has to be separation between the speaker, legislative, and the executive. In Malaysia, we see a lot of interference. I think there has to be political will. There has to be amendment, even to the constitution or even to the standing orders. Because even right now, I think the simplest question that we always say, who has the power to call for a parliament session? One interpretation says that it's the speaker. As the leader of the house, he should be able to do it. But then there is a standing order and of course a constitutional requirement that the leader of the house is the prime minister of the day. So you need the prime minister to call for the sessions and so on and so forth. So in order for maybe a certain empowerment to the speaker, that has to be that provision has to be amended. That provision has to be reformed. Whatever government of the day is, whether they are willing to reform that is a big question. Because I think so David mentioned it right at the start. I think every government would want some advantage in parliament, and the biggest advantage you have is the speaker. So to reform that, it takes a lot of political will from both sides to do it. So of course, in principle, I am fully agreeable. I believe in more parliamentary reforms to give more recognition to even for private members' bill. Right now, as I said, we submit a bill even to change